Hello, class. It's Miss Roberts here, and today we're going to explore intercultural communication. Let's begin. Let me go ahead and set up the PowerPoint. Put myself over here. Okay, so in this chapter, we're going to explore several communication studies theories in regard to intercultural communication. In this chapter, we're going to talk about different dimensions of cultures and social communities. When we think of intercultural communication, because it's just so many cultures and so vast, what researchers have done is placed several cultures in different categories, and these categories is what we call dimensions. We're also going to explore four relationships between culture and communication and guidelines for adapting communication effectively. So if you recall systems theory from the beginning of the semester, we realized that within a certain phenomena or within communication itself, that we are a part of a larger system, a larger group. So what affects one affects the whole. And culture has a similar setup. We're interconnected, and here are some examples of how we're interconnected. With computer-mediated communication, we can interact with people across the globe. The world is a lot smaller now because of computer technology. Social media is also a way for us to form friendships, relationships, and find communities. Also, with the rise of work from home positions, technology has allowed us to work together as teams, even if we're on different parts of the globe. Okay. But what is culture? There are many definitions across chapters and across disciplines about what culture is, but overall, it's a way of life with people and it contains systems of ideas, values, beliefs, customs, and language. It's passed from one generation to the next and it sustains a particular way of life. We can talk about or think about national ethnic culture or religious culture. You've even expanded the definition of culture to certain widespread hobbies like gaming and being environmentalist or veganism. So, with culture and with the expanded version of culture, we can get an idea of understanding that there are certain cultures that we belong to, and there are certain cultures that are different from us. And that's another aspect of culture. We can seek community familiarity with those who share certain characteristics, whether it be our ethnic national culture, generational culture, being Southern California, etc. But we also can learn from people who are not like us and who are outside of our norms. So let's explore social communities. A social community is comprised of groups of people who live within a dominant culture and who belong to other social group or groups. So you think about ethnic cultures, religious cultures, people in LGBT community, people with disabilities, or disabled people. You can see that these are small enclaves of people that exist within a larger culture. But there's also standpoint theory. It's the political awareness of social, symbolic, and material circumstances of the community and the larger power dynamics that hold circumstances in place. So if you think about the dynamics between a dominant culture and non-dominant dominant cultures or minority cultures, you can see or you can find examples of how certain communities maintain their culture, or they have experiences interacting with a dominant culture. And we can see the dynamics, or we can understand the consequences of those differing power dynamics. Now, with social media, with greater awareness, and with education, and with further exploration of intercultural communication, we can understand certain community viewpoints and experiences as we explore who they are, as more marginalized voices come to the forefront. And because of that, we gain the political awareness and circumstances of the community. But when you think of back in the days, a lot of these marginalized voices and stories weren't heard, but now they're coming to the forefront. Now, here are just a few dimensions of cultures. Like I mentioned earlier, when we think of dimensions of cultures, there are so many cultures around the globe that we find, theorists found commonalities in certain cultures and label certain behaviors, patterns, and belief systems. So, for example, individualistic versus collectivistic cultures. In these cultures, they understand themselves as a of and interconnected with their families, groups, and cultures. So with more individualistic cultures, we, and I say we as Americans and those in Western nations such as Canada, the UK, and Australia, we go outside the world and we represent ourselves. But when you think of more collectivistic cultures, not only do they represent and think of them of the group, but their language and their mindset is about group harmony and collective uplift versus individualistic cultures are about self-improvement and self-uplift. With uncertainty avoidance, it's the extent in which people want to avoid ambiguity and vagueness. So in some cultures, there is a tolerance for ambiguity in an interaction. So they may not have as many rigid rules as cultures with high uncertainty avoidance, which they may provide different rules of communication to make these interactions predictable. Then there's also power distance. It's the size and gap between people with high and low power. So for cultures with high power distance, that means people who are on the top of the hierarchy, whether that may be bosses, parents, teachers, authority figures. There is behavioral and psychological distance between those who are in subordinate positions such as workers, kids, subordinate job positions, students. But for those cultures with low power distance, although the hierarchy is still there, behaviors and viewpoints of both person on the top of the hierarchy and the lower part of the hierarchy are not as wide. So there might be more dialogue, more egalitarianism between the two entities versus high partisan cultures. Then we have cultures that are labeled masculine versus feminine. So it's to the extent that a culture values male-oriented traits. These can be aggressiveness, competitiveness, self-interest, domination, similar to American culture and most Western cultures, versus female-oriented traits, such as gentleness, cooperation, care for others, and harmony. Now, with masculine and feminine labeled cultures, it doesn't necessarily mean or give indication about the relations between men and women. These are just how we label certain traits and certain goals and certain mindsets of these cultures, and we labeled it masculine and feminine. Then we have long versus short-term orientation. It's to the extent in which a culture thinks in long term, history versus future versus short term. So if you think in the long term, you make future plans, you think of generations, and your mindset, goals, and day-to-day life differs for those who think in the present, in the now, and what's going on right now. So we just talked about individualism versus collectivism. In individualistic cultures, these cultures are more about self-interest, self-uplift, and they walk into the world representing themselves. Versus with collectivistic cultures, it's more about the group dynamic, group harmony, and when they walk out into the world, they represent their communities, families, and culture. There's also linguistic consequences of how our culture comes into play. So we have low context culture, like in America, Canada, Western Europe, and Australia, where there is a direct, explicit, and detailed communication style. So, for example, if I say the color blue, I mean blue. If I get directions, I give straightforward directions. Think about how we write an essay in our schools. We have our introduction, thesis, body paragraphs, recap, and conclusion. So there's clarification throughout the process and clarity throughout the process. Very direct, ambiguous, and vague language can frustrate people in low context cultures. They're very get to the point, especially Americans, people in Western society, Scandinavian cultures, etc. But we also have high context cultures. It's an indirect, not detailed, implicit communication style. So there's context, layers, nuance, and ritual in conversation and in communication. And you have to know how to navigate these spaces. So if you're from a low context culture, you may not understand everything in a high context culture because it's indirect. There's subtext. There is, excuse me, there are layers to the conversation. I recall in a video about high and low context cultures where the narrator described an interaction with her and a coworker from a high context culture. Mind you, she was American and from a low context culture. The colleague from a high context culture, to paraphrase, the chairman, who was American and of course also from a low context culture, presented a meeting and set the meeting, gave the presentation, and that was that. When the narrator talked to her colleague from the high context culture, the colleague said that they were listening with all their senses. And the narrator was confused. She was like, "What do you mean?" What the colleague meant was coming from a high context culture, we had to make sure there was no subtext or other messages within the actual message. But because the presenter of the information was from a low context culture, what they said could be trusted at face value or was meant to be interpreted at face value. So overall, low context cultures, very direct language, detailed, clarifying, excuse me, asking for clarification is paramount. High context cultures, indirect, relies on nonverbals, and relies on one knowing and understanding those nuances. So in order to become a competent intercultural communicator, you must engage in person-centered communication and be open to others' feelings and ideas. You also want to be open to ideas that are not familiar to you and avoid being ethnocentric, feeling that your own culture is superior, and you want to have or understand cultural relativism, meaning that cultures vary in thought, action, behavior, and beliefs, and understand that may differ from yours. So, adapting to cultural diversity is a process. If you ever have the opportunity to travel across the country, maybe do a study abroad program, or just be a tourist in a space, you want to be respectful of that space. For those who are staying more long term, they may have to go from culture shock to cultural adaptation. So they may resist some of those differences, say, hey, they don't do this like they do at home. Then they try to assimilate to the behaviors and thoughts of their surroundings. When in Rome, be like the Romans. Have tolerance. So making sure that they are open-minded, like we just talked about, open-minded to different thoughts, open-minded to different experiences, and tolerating that ambiguity, that uncertainty avoidance that we talked about. It's hard to avoid uncertainty where these intercultural interactions are new to the person. Understanding each other, gaining understanding, and going back to tolerance and understanding that sometimes you might not get everything right in that first interaction, but being willing to try again, respecting the other culture, and then participating in cultural events, adapting the language, and being a part of that culture. So, in summary, we just talked about cultures and social communities, talked about the principles between cultural and communication, outlined guidelines for effectively communicating in an intercultural context, and we went over the, excuse me, adapting to a different culture or diverse experiences. Okay. So thank you so much for listening. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you so much. Good night.